Today we're looking at the wedding in Cana, where Jesus performs his first miracle, turning the water into wine. Had a tremendous impact on the guests that were there, had a tremendous impact on his mother, and on those disciples who said at the end of this passage, "We believe." They became mere followers of Jesus Christ at this point in their lives, to becoming believers and followers as disciples. Thank you for tuning in today. I have had many weddings, and some of them have absolutely been gorgeous, beautiful. Most of them have been very pretty. But I've had so many stories about weddings, I could write a book about weddings alone. I had a wedding one time that the family of the bride spent $32,000 on flowers for the wedding. And then they complained about giving a $100 honorarium to the second minister. I've had a number of bridezillas. I had one wedding where during the premarital counseling, the bride ran out of the office screaming. I had one wedding that it's really fun. A lot of them I just laugh at now. Had one wedding where we had the unity candle over here, and they lit the unity candle and the air conditioning cut on and blew the candle right out. So they relit it. It blew it out a second time. They relit it a third time and it blew it out. Finally, I turned to the congregation. I said, "I guess there's not a lot of unity here today." And everybody, of course, chuckled. I had a wedding one time where bridezilla, she was beautiful. She was wearing a gown that was a little immodest. And she was so wound up, she took something to relieve her nerves about 30 minutes before the wedding on an empty stomach. And she got so sick, we had to delay the wedding. And as we delayed the wedding, we announced to the groom that it was going to be a 10-minute or 15-minute delay. He didn't just cry, he sobbed out loud, wailing. I went, holy cow. And then she came down the aisle. You know how your eye is drawn to something you don't want to look at? She had spittle right here. And during the wedding, I'm going, dearly beloved. I had another wedding where the groomsmen, there were 6 boys in that family. The youngest was getting married. The youngest. And during the rehearsal, the oldest brother came down the aisle and grabbed his youngest brother by the face and kissed him right on the mouth. And in my smart way, I said, "I bet you won't do that tomorrow." He didn't. All of his brothers did. I had another wedding, a bridezilla wedding at 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock weddings are supposed to be very formal, right? If you go by the old book of etiquette written by, Gloria Vanderbilt, book of etiquette. And so, and that was that whole bridezilla, that didn't even cover this one. At 4, I hate to say I chuckle, but at 4:30 as people were arriving, a horrific storm came through. And those poor women had their hair blown everywhere. They had makeup running down their chin. And I'm going, trying not to laugh. But the point is, weddings to me are a lot of work. Also, I tend to give people five counseling sessions before I do the wedding. There's a lot of time involved. But my point is today the wedding in Cana. Understanding this, the text says that these guys, and whatever word you want to put in the outline, it probably doesn't matter. But what I want to talk about today a little bit is this. These disciples. Now, you know there's a passage, I believe it's in Luke, maybe in Matthew and Mark as well, I don't recall, that says they followed him because of the food he gave them and because of the miracles he did. In other words, they followed him for the show, right? And I've seen that in our current generation as well. I don't know how to process all that, but one of the things I think about these 12, Matthew is probably the only person missing in action this day. He's probably out in the parking lot handing out tax bills because he's a tax collector. And anyway, when I think about this situation, why did these guys leave their boats and follow this guy named Jesus? I mean, he was a nobody, really, wasn't he? He was a carpenter's son, hadn't done really anything to deserve being followed, if you will, if you please. Hadn't done anything at all. And that's true today. You will see people that you think know better that get caught up in religious cults. And you go, how did that happen? Well, they were following a person. And at this point in the life of Jesus, they're following a person. Why are they doing this? I don't know. He certainly must have had a certain amount of charisma about him. He must have had some panache of sorts, he's following. And then he takes him to this wedding. Now, understanding the context of this wedding is very, very important. Jewish weddings were made up of several components, the first of which was an engagement, and that engagement, my understanding is, could be called off. But the second step was a betrothal step. And you didn't call the wedding off if you got to the betrothal step. You had to go to the elders of the community and get a bill of divorce to walk out of a wedding at that point. And then you had a public ceremony. And during this public ceremony, you also had a party. Now, understanding the significance of this party is huge. Now, how many people came to this party? Enough that they filled up all these water pots, if you will, with wine because they ran out. Think about that. Now, I call myself sometimes still pretty naive at my age, still pretty naive. I went to a Leukemia Foundation banquet. I was invited there by a neighbor. And knowing the neighbor, I should have known better. But he asked me to go to this banquet. I thought, oh, okay, I'll go. And we're in Williamston at the time, and everybody in the community that is anybody, so to speak, is there. I show up, I'm sitting at this table, and I noticed that there was a lot of wine on the tables. And the wine on the tables was apparently fairly significant. And I don't drink wine, and I don't know anything about wine, but supposedly it's very good wine. But the second round, they brought out the cardboard boxes with wine that's probably in 5-gallon buckets. And their plan was to get everybody a little tipsy so that their bidding and their pledges would get more and more generous. And apparently it worked. I mean, I sat there in amazement as people began making pledges for significant money in this environment. I was stunned. But what their plan did, it worked. Except for John and Cheryl, who were probably the only people in the room that did not make a pledge. And we're probably the only people in the room that weren't drinking. But the point is, weddings are significant events, and wine, in this case, they started with the bad stuff, quote unquote. It probably wasn't bad, it's probably good, because a cultural faux pas in that world would be to run out of wine, would be a horrible faux pas. And a cultural big misstep that would be talked about for years. And I do mean years. And so when they come to this point, they're really grasping for adulthood, if you will, in the life of the disciples. Jesus' mother was there, and his disciples had also been invited. I'm curious about why they were there. I don't think of Jesus going to parties, but apparently he did. And at this point, my next point is, when the wine is gone, now think about it, that's a significant statement here. When the wine is gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. And I think it's important to hear this. He says, dear woman, and some have misunderstood that phrase to say that he is speaking down to his mother. That's not at all the case. The dear woman phrase is a phrase of endearment. And it's also repeatedly throughout the New Testament when Jesus talks to Mary or Martha. He calls them dear woman. It's a title that they embraced. We have no more wine. Now, Jesus is going, why are you telling me this? He says, my time has not yet come. Why are you involving me in this? Now, I think in my life, I find myself kind of getting pulled into things I shouldn't be involved with, and it always ends up badly for me when I do that. But in this case, Jesus is getting pulled into something, and he's going, okay. My next point really is this. This is a very significant statement. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. That's a significant statement. And I would offer today, and again, I'm trying to not do too much metaphor with this, I would offer today that Jesus, not Jesus' mother perhaps, I don't want to beify Mary, but the point being is Jesus is still saying, are you going to do what I tell you to do? That's what I get out of this passage. Are we going to do what he says for us to do? And in fact, Jesus, when he hears these words, I'm sure he perks up and he goes, wow, this is significant. Now, it's significant for a variety of reasons, because what she is doing, ready for this? She is handing off authority to Jesus. He is now an adult. She is saying to Jesus probably something like this, you're 30 years old, big boy. It's time for you to step up and take care of problems. I've been taking care of problems long enough. Now, how many of us have ever said that or wanted to say that to a relative that we had with us? It's time to man up. That phrase, I hear it often, usually by people that are pretty frustrated. Anybody ever said that to your son? Time to grow up? Well, that's the point of this passage. Mary is saying, do what he says to do is a handoff of really relationship and authority. Do what he says you to do. Because prior to that, who's in charge? Probably Mary. Now, I wouldn't press that too far. Well, here's the deal. Jesus says, in this gift, trust to follow. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding approximately 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus says to his servants, fill the jars up with water. Now again, this is the handoff. Prior to this, Mary's kind of in charge. Now Jesus is taking charge and saying, do this. And Mary says, do whatever he tells you to do now. And it says, now, he says, so they filled them up to the brim. Now, this morning over at White Oak, it's kind of fun. I was sitting there before the service, and we were talking about parents and parenting. I was talking with an older gentleman about some things like that. He said, I took my dad so seriously. He actually whacked me on the back of the head one time, playfully, I'm sure. He said, Daddy, I want to plant a tree. And he said, go ahead and plant it, but you need to water that tree every day or it'll die. He went out in the middle of a rainstorm and watered the tree. And his dad kind of whacked him on the side of the head and said, son, he said, but Daddy, that's what you told me to do. I do it every day. But here's Jesus, these followers are going to take him at his word and say, we're not only going to do what he says do, we're going to go the second mile, we're going to fill it up to the brim. And all this is significant. And then he says, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. So they probably had, I envision the old metal bucket cup, I'm talking about, the old dipping cup. They dip some out and they go over to the head person, and the guy says, whoa, this is really good stuff. How'd this happen? Now, understanding this, the debate here often gets, I want to say crazy, but I'm not sure I should say crazy. The debate gets really messed up, because what people often do is they begin to debate whether this wine had alcohol in it or not. That is not the point. That's not the point at all. I've heard people say, yeah, it probably had alcohol in it, but you couldn't hold enough to get drunk off of it. Prove that from the text. When Peter was accused of being drunk on the day of Pentecost, his response was, it's too early in the day for that. So you know that there's probably alcohol involved in this. But so what? That's not the point of the passage at all. I just think we waste our energy if we begin making that the point. And so they fill it to the brim. He says, take it to the master of the banquet. Well, you've probably heard the story about the preacher who goes down the road, gets pulled for speeding. And the patrolman looks in the car and says, have you been drinking? And the preacher says, no, I haven't been drinking. And he says, well, what's that in that bottle over there? He said, that's water. Hand it to me. Hands it to the patrolman. The patrolman takes a whiff and says, man, that's wine. He says, praise the Lord, he's done it again. If somebody uses that on you, I want to hear about it. But the point is, not the alcohol. So they taste the wine and they go, whoa, this is really good. Once again, Jesus is asserting himself as God. Who can do this but God, right? Who has the authority over matter but God? That's the point. And all of a sudden, pardon me, all of a sudden the things change in a hurry. What changes, he did not realize where it had come from. The servants who had drawn the water knew. Then they called the bridegroom aside. Now, understanding this, I mentioned many, many weddings. In this day and age, at this wedding, the party goes on for 7 whole days. So you know they went through a bunch of wine. And again, it's a huge social faux pas in that culture to run out of anything, food or drink. And so when the wine comes out, it's been turned water to wine, the bridegroom had to have been blown away, with thanksgiving, certainly. He said everybody brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine afterwards. So they start with a nice bottle of wine, and later they serve Ripple or something. And it doesn't matter. But not this case. He reverses course, right? He does exactly the opposite of what the culture is expecting. Why is that? Because Jesus is that way. Whatever our culture expects often is wrong. And Jesus is challenging the culture in that day by doing this miracle. And he's doing something fresh and something new. In other words, he's revealing that he is the Son of God. He's beginning to reveal the gospel. Now, in the next part of this chapter, we won't get there today. Next part of this chapter, he leaves and goes from here toward Jerusalem and cleanses the temple. There are 2 cleansings of the temple. The first one happens right after this first miracle. He goes in and turns the tables over because they had turned the temple into a den of thieves. And that's not one they get overly upset about and try to kill him. The later one is when they try to kill him. But the point being, he's offering something totally new. And he says, you saved the best for last. He says, this is the first of his miraculous signs Jesus performed in Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory. His time has come. He's revealed his glory. And when it talks about revealing his glory, there's a catchphrase in the Gospels that is worth underlining when you see it. And that underlining is this. He's going toward Jerusalem. When it says he's headed to Jerusalem, that is code, if you will, for I'm going to the cross. And in fact, in the next miracle he does, when he turns over the tables in the temple, he says, you might kill me and I'll raise up in 3 days. He's already talking about going to the cross. And he takes 3 years for him to get there. This is the first miracle, and the last miracle is the resurrection. In fact, he says, this is the culmination of this passage. This is what this passage is really all about. And his disciples put their faith in him. Wow. They had been following him for some reason other than the truth. And the word faith there is a verb. They put their trust in him. They received him. They made that decision. And so when I struggle with the conversion times of these disciples, and I go back to this passage, they're now following Jesus because they're believing. Now, here's the point for us today. Mary says, do what Jesus says. Again, I don't want to beify Mary, but I think we can hear those words as well. Do what Jesus says. And then also, to become a disciple, we have to quit looking at the world and participating that way. We need to look in our hearts and make sure that we've trusted Him, we believe Him, and we've received Him. And now as a disciple, I want to live for Him every day. And how we reflect that in our daily lives is a huge part of our witness, empowering us to reach those around us. Holy moly, what a chore that is, right? It's not a chore at all. Just love Jesus and love one another. Jesus made it very simple, didn't He? He said, love God, love your neighbor. How simple is that? How that fleshes out for us, well, let me offer this. It was seen in what we did last week. Did you notice the numbers for the care offering we took? How stunning was that? How stunning was that? Over $2,000 in offering to help those around us. Holy moly. I felt bad for Betsy and Beth and Wanda trying to sort all that out in the counting process. I didn't really feel bad at all. I was actually pretty excited. But the point is, we can be the church and love God, love our neighbor, and do a good job of reaching other people for Christ as we follow Him. In His name I offer this. Amen. Thank you for tuning in to Horns Methodist Church. If this message has been helpful at all, give us a call at 252-237-4616. We'd love to talk with you about this or anything else related to your spiritual journey. God bless and have a great week.